Okay. Juana. So, how do you identify?
I identify as queer. And in terms of my gender, I identify as femme. But yeah, I think I really like queer. I'm not totally sure what a lesbian is. So queer gives me a little more space in
Yes.
terms of, it just makes a little more sense to me. Yeah.
Yes, I would have to agree with that.
Yeah.
Awesome. And so, I'm glad you mentioned the word femme.
Yeah.
Because in terms of thinking about visibility, because, this is about being out.
Right.
And so if you're not visibly queer, or
Yeah.
what, I mean...
Right. What's imagined as visibly queer.
Yes.
So I pass as heterosexual all the time. And that makes it actually much more incumbent on me to come out. A long time ago, I was, in a situation, because again, I'm always assumed that I'm heterosexual, and I was on an airplane, and this guy was sort of going on about his wife, and do you have anyone? And so it was this moment of, do I come out? And, you're on an airplane, so he's not going to beat you or bash you. I don't know him. He has no control over my job, my work, or anything. But the fact that I was even thinking about it meant that I had to sort of come to terms with the fact that he might not like me. He might be freaked out. He might want to change his seat. Or he might be totally into it in ways that are freaky and weird.
Yes.
And that's kind of worse.
Yes. Yes, that is worse.
But it is sort of confronting what it means to the reasons why we don't always come out. And a lot of them have to do with other people's comfort. Yeah.
Okay. And so in terms of being out in academia, being out in the classroom, what exactly does that mean to you?
It's curious because one of the things is that queer studies is what I teach and what I do. And so in some ways, but even as I do that, I remember teaching once, and I had this one student that every time he raised his hand, Diego, he would say, as a mixed race, bisexual, cis man, I really liked the movie, right?
Yes, always.
And
always,
so
yeah.
using the identity category to justify, as if there was some relationship between the identities we might use to describe ourselves and the ideas we might hold, right? So I actually don't make a very big deal about coming out because I don't want my students to use their sexuality or their race or their gender or anything else to as a way to form their arguments, right?
Yeah.
I actually want them to form their arguments.
Right.
So I love the essay, The Evidence of Experience, like how experience gets used to construct arguments. But it's a Joan Scott quote, and it's like, experience is both always already an interpretation and something to be interpreted. So the language in which we describe our experiences is already our way of interpreting those experiences, right?
Yeah.
They're not unmediated, right? We come to them through language, and we come to language through social and cultural understandings of meaning. So even in describing our experiences, they've already been interpreted for us, and there's never this unmediated thing that's experienced.
Yeah.
So when I talk about it in class, I really try to push students to see that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, right now I'm teaching a class that, now we're starting to do some queer stuff, but it's 172 students. Oh my God.
Oh yeah, you told me.
Yeah,
You told me you were
so it's
teaching
this
huge.
very general American cultures, biochem students, and things like that. And, I think through the course of the class, I think if students have been paying attention, I've come out.
Mm-hmm.
But because I kind of don't always make a big deal about, like, so I might say something about my partner, or I might say something about my kid, the way in which, teachers tell stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
We tell stories all the time.
Yes.
And
yes.
so in that sense, it's not a single coming out moment.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually a lot of moments, sort of coming out as someone whose parents don't speak English,
Mm-hmm.
coming out as someone that comes from a very, working class family, coming out as someone that has a child, coming out as someone that went to, community college.
Mm-hmm.
So those are all different kinds of coming out that I
Mm-hmm.
do to students that then they kind of piece together
Mm-hmm.
to imagine who I might be instead of just the person that stands in front of them.
So you think you think it's important to tell stories about ourselves to our students?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I'm always looking to make connections between the material that I teach
Mm-hmm.
and students' lives.
Mm-hmm.
And part of how I do that is making connections between the materials that I teach and my own life and the lives of other people around them. And so, it's not that I do that every class or for
Right.
every issue, but sometimes I want them to, think differently. So we were actually talking about, sort of gay marriage, and I was sort of saying, if I was, I wish I could marry my sister, because my sister needs health care.
Got it.
So now they know I have a sister.
Right.
And it's like, my partner, she's doing fine.
Yeah.
She has a job, but my sister doesn't have any health care. So if I was to, in thinking about what domestic partnerships are,
Yeah.
well, what if you and your sister are raising your kids together, you're pooling your income, you're providing childcare for one another, you're each other's backup, and this is your family,
Yeah.
right? So how is that completely illegible to the state?
Right.
So, I mean, I don't live with my sister. She's not my domestic partner.
Yeah.
But again, in a way, it's a story.
Right.
That even though it's not true, it's creating a kind of hypothetical scenario where you get to see other possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I guess in a sense,
just one more thing about that, because one of the things that I think is interesting as both a scholar and someone that tries to work towards kinds of social justice is to be able to not just critique what exists, but to be kind of willing to risk imagining other possibilities, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can totally critique what gay marriage is, but it's also, we need to start thinking about what other possibilities are. So, what's a kinship registry? And maybe that has problems.
Right.
Maybe that's not perfect.
Right.
But all of these things, but you kind of have to be willing to at least try.
Right.
Because if not, just critique is easy.
Right.
So one of the things that I try to give my students is kind of, be willing to teach them not just to critique, but also try to get them to think about, how else could we be doing this, right?
Right. I think that's super important, and I think it's an excellent pedagogical method.
We try.
Yeah. and so, in a sense, your life experience has a lot to do with the material you teach, right? I mean, obviously not entirely, but it interacts with you know, with queer theory and social realities and so on. And so, what are your thoughts on, you know, other professors or grad students who are teaching things that don't invite these kinds of conversations? What is...
I think that it's, if we think about, I mean, I think that whenever we teach, we're inviting students to interpret things.
Mm-hmm.
And part of interpretation is bringing what we know about the world to bear on a certain text.
Mm.
And so thinking about, in some ways, understanding what we know about the world, the assumptions that we're bringing to that text, where those assumptions come from, and how useful they are, or whose interests they're serving, right? So in that sense, I think whenever you're, certainly in the humanities, it's about interpretation, right? But to understand interpretation as something that is so social, right? And so whenever you're in the realm of the social, you're actually thinking about these things, because you're thinking about power, and you're thinking about how people connect or don't connect, or things like that.
Cool. So, moving a little bit, it still has to do with teaching, but so I found out that you once taught at Bryn Mawr.
Yes.
And I have a personal connection with Bryn Mawr, but
what's your personal connection?
No, my ex went there, and
okay.
I spent a lot of time hanging out there.
I bet you did. Very queer campus.
Yes. So what was it like to be teaching a bunch of queer women, and you know, just comparing it with the kind of experience in the classroom at Berkeley?
You know, one of the things that the queerness was just, that part was easy and fine. What was crazy was the kind of class privilege. That was just, I had never been around people, that many wealthy people, where the assumption of wealth and access was just the given.
Right.
And so for example, you know, most of the time the girls would go to class in like their pajamas, which was just fine. It was great.
They do it here too sometimes.
Yeah, you know, but there was one day where they, apparently in one of the dorms, they had been running a brothel. And so once a year, you know, because, you know, Bryn Mawr's all about traditions.
Yeah.
So once a year they had this tradition where they would all dress up as, like, pimps and hoes. And they all dressed up as pimps and hoes, and it almost looked like a Wednesday in San Francisco. Do you know what I mean? Like, you saw fishnets and boots and short skirts and lipstick.
Yeah.
I mean, just kind of a Wednesday on Valencia Street in San Francisco. So that was kind of interesting. How the whiteness of the place, regardless of the people in the place, was literally etched into the buildings. Was just, you know, you would, like, it was the portraits on the walls, it was the librarian, they had this black librarian. Apparently the books in the library, all the books about Europe were, you know how they put those hardcovers on them? Library books, right?
Yeah.
Those were all in white. But, you know, the 7 books about Africa were all bound in black. Latin America, we were red. And books about Asia were bound in yellow. So then this way you would know what part of the world you were studying just by looking at, like, it was like this was their system of categorizing books.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Wow.
What was interesting about the queer stuff was the way in which it was both everywhere and not really talked about. Because you would see these, they were all about the, alumni. And, women that had gone to college that 50 years later, they're still traveling to India together. Or, so, like, what lesbian was, these kind of strong female friendships. And so the brochures would be all about, like, where young women can develop strong female friendships that last a lifetime. And you see these two women under a tree reading a book together. And you can read that in all of these sort of, homosocial ways. And then there are all those boys at Haverford. I mean, so, so it's both, here's this possibility for queer, but there's also, don't worry,
Right,
you'll still
don't
get
worry.
married at the end of the day. You'll graduate and you'll go on to live a nice, healthy life.
Yeah.
So that was so the kind of queer was interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was an interesting place.
Yeah.
But there were, all the language departments had at least two. Spanish, French, German, like all just filled with queer faculty.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it was kind of pretty awesome. Dykes to Watch Out For was in their little student newspaper.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it kind of was.
Yeah.
But also having tiny classes.
Yeah, that's so important to be able to really have a contact with a student.
Yeah. And so over and over again. And so those students, I mean, I left Bryn Mawr in like 2005 or something. And I still remember those students because I had them in multiple classes. They were really small.
So last question.
Okay.
What do you think are the greatest misconceptions about queer and gender studies?
Well, in terms of, our department's called Gender and Women's Studies, and people don't think that we're talking about men or heterosexuals. So the fact that we're talking about systems of understanding gender and sexuality that actually impact everybody is, I think, one of the misconceptions about gender and sexuality. That LGBT studies is about just learning about LGBT people and not really interrogating how those categories came to exist, the kind of influence they exert on other fields of study, how we come to know ourselves through these categories, how they've been produced for us. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. That was perfect.
Good.